do things, and then you're hosed. In most fields, a hunger for action is a virtue. But as Buffett said at Berkshire's 1998 annual meeting, we don't get paid for activity, just for being right. Pabrai, a loner with a misanthropic streak, was purpose-built for the bizarrely lucrative discipline of sitting alone in a room and occasionally buying a mispriced stock. Back when he ran a tech company, he hired 2 industrial psychologists to profile him. They revealed how comically ill-suited he was to managing a large staff. "I'm not this nurturing leader who can have a bunch of weepies and nurture them and babysit them and all this other shit." Investing felt more like a game of 3-dimensional chess in which the outcome, crucially, depended solely on him. Say no to almost everything. One of Pabrai's first stock picks was a tiny Indian technology company, Satyam Computer Services, which he bought in 1995. He understood the business since he worked in the same industry, and the stock was ultra cheap. Pabrai watched in wonder as it rose about 140 times in 5 years. He sold in 2000 when it was outrageously overvalued and pocketed a $1.5 million profit. The late 90s tech bubble then burst, and the stock dropped more than 80%. Amused by his good fortune, Pabrai cheerfully likens himself to Forrest Gump, who made a killing in some kind of fruit company, namely Apple Computer. Through a combination of luck and smarts, Pabrai turned his $1 million into $10 million in less than 5 years. Aware that he had more to learn, he wrote to Buffett offering to work for him for free. Buffett replied, "I've given a lot of thought to the optimal use of my time, and I simply do best operating by myself." So Pabrai pursued Plan B. Several friends had profited from his stock tips, and they wanted him to manage their money. In 1999, he launched an investment partnership with $900,000 from 8 people and $100,000 of his own. A year or so later, he sold his technology consulting company, TransTech, for $6 million so that he could focus exclusively on investing. From 1956 to 1969, Buffett had managed investment partnerships with spectacular success. So Pabrai did what came naturally. He cloned every detail of Buffett's partnership model. For example, Buffett charged no annual management fee, but collected a performance fee of 25% of any profits over an annual hurdle of 6%. If he made a return of 6% or less, he didn't get paid a dime, but outsized returns would be richly rewarded. Pabrai adopted the same fee structure, reasoning that this alignment of interests made it an honorable way to do business. Most hedge funds charge a 2% management fee plus 20% of the profits, a structure that Pabrai describes as heads I win, tails you lose. If these funds make a 10% return, their shareholders' take after fees is only 6.4%. These high frictional costs doom hedge fund investors as a class to lag the market over the long run. By contrast, if Pabrai makes a 10% return, his shareholders receive 9%. After the 2008-9 financial crisis, he earned no fees for several years. At the time, he told me, "I've been living on fresh air, water, and peanuts. I'm ready for mutton and curry." The feast arrived in 2017, when his flagship fund returned 92.2%, and he earned more than $40 million in performance fees. As it happens, Buffett had borrowed this fee structure from Graham, who used it in the 1920s. No stranger to cloning, Buffett has said, "If you learn basically from other people, you don't have to get too many ideas on your own. You can just apply the best of what you see. Part of the challenge is to discern the best and jettison the rest, instead of blindly cloning everything." For example, Graham was a devout believer in diversification, whereas Buffett got rich by focusing his bets on a much smaller number of undervalued stocks. This is an important point. Buffett borrowed liberally, but he adapted and refined Graham's practices to suit his own preferences. Following Buffett's lead, Parbrai constructed an unusually concentrated portfolio. He figured that 10 stocks would give him all the diversification he needed. When you're buying so few stocks, you can afford to be choosy. Parbrai glances at hundreds of stocks and rapidly rejects almost all of them, often in less than a minute. Where does Parbrai get his investment ideas? He borrows them by analyzing the portfolios of leading investors such as Buffett, Ted Weschler, Seth Klarman, and David Einhorn. Parbrai glances at their top 3 or 4 holdings, which are listed each quarter in an investment manager's 13F filings, and tries to figure out why these are their favorite ideas. He couldn't understand why Weschler and Einhorn liked General Motors, which seemed an obvious dud. After 6 weeks of intense research, he had figured it out. That led to an enormously lucrative bet on auto stocks, most notably in Fiat Chrysler. Buffett is a master of this practice of high-speed sifting. What he's looking for is a reason to say no, and as soon as he finds that, he's done, says Parbrai. Indeed, Buffett has said, the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. Buffett provided Parbrai with several simple filters that helped him to streamline the sifting. First, says Parbrai, one of Buffett's core commandments is that you can invest in a company only if it falls within your circle of competence. When Parbrai analyzes a company, he starts by asking, is this something I truly understand? He pushes himself to consider whether he's at the center of his circle of competence, approaching its edge, or outside it. Second, the company has to trade at a large enough discount to its underlying value to provide a significant margin of safety. Parbrai doesn't bother to construct elaborate Excel spreadsheets that might give him an illusion that he can precisely predict the future. He wants an investment that's so cheap that it's a no-brainer. That usually means paying less than 50 cents for $1 worth of assets. I have very simple criteria. If something is not going to be an obvious double in a short period of time, 2 or 3 years, I have no interest. Third, under Munger's influence, Buffett gradually shifted away from stocks that were merely cheap toward an emphasis on buying better businesses. Among other things, this meant that a company should have a durable competitive advantage and should be run by an honest, capable CEO. Munger pointed out to Parbrai that Graham, who was fixated on buying stocks that were quantitatively cheap, scored his best returns by owning Geico. It didn't make him money because it was cheap, says Parbrai. It made him money because it was a great business. Fourth, the company's financial statements should be clear and simple. As Buffett observed, the only reason that one may not understand a financial statement is because the writer does not want you to understand it. If it isn't easy to figure out how the business generates cash today and roughly how much it's likely to generate in the years to come, Buffett relegates it to what he calls the too hard pile. Parbrai once took a photograph of a box on Buffett's desk that is literally labeled too hard, a visual reminder to resist the lure of complexity. Enron and Valiant Pharmaceuticals, both of which blew up, were easy for Parbrai to reject on that basis alone. For Parbrai, one of the secrets of successful investing is to avoid anything that's too hard. He automatically passes on investments in countries such as Russia and Zimbabwe, given their contempt for shareholder rights. He avoids all startups and initial public offerings, IPOs, since he's unlikely to find bargains in arenas dominated by sales hype and inflated expectations. He has never sold a stock short because the maximum upside is 100% if the stock falls to zero, while the downside is unlimited if the stock soars. Why bet with those odds? He asks. He also largely ignores the infinite complexity of macroeconomics, focusing instead on a handful of critical micro-factors that are likely to drive a specific business. In short, simplicity rules. These basic principles that we've just discussed are extraordinarily robust and have served Parbrai well. But what's remarkable is that none of this is original. Every major idea on which he has built his investment career has been stolen from Buffett, except for the one stolen from Munger. Writing about this makes me slightly queasy. How can I hope to say anything new or profound while enumerating ideas that Parbrai has ripped off from other people? But that's precisely the point. His competitive advantage lies in the fact that he doesn't care whether you or I think he's derivative. All he cares about is what works. One evening, over dinner at a Korean restaurant in Irvine, I asked Parbrai why more people don't clone in his systematic way. Between mouthfuls of a dish called Spicy Beef Danger, he replies, "They're not as shameless as me. They have more ego. To be a great cloner, you have to check your ego at the door." The guru, his disciple, and their $650,100 lunch. Parbrai's purloined investment approach worked like a dream. When he launched Parbrai Funds in July 1999, the tech bubble was about to burst. It was a perilous time to be an investor. Over the next 8 years, the best-performing US index, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, eked out an annualized return of 4.6% versus Parbrai's annualized return of 29.4% after fees. The media hailed him as a superstar, the next Warren Buffett, and the Oracle of Irvine. His assets under management swelled to $600 million. He recalls, "I could do nothing wrong." Parbrai's returns were driven by a string of bets on undervalued stocks gripped by uncertainty. For example, he invested in Embraer, a Brazilian producer of jets, shortly after the 9/11 terror attacks, which caused many airlines to cancel aircraft orders. This short-term shock led fearful investors to overlook the longer-term reality that Embraer was still a high-quality business with a superior product, low manufacturing costs, first-rate management, and loads of cash on its balance sheet. Parbrai paid about $12 per share in 2001 and sold his last shares for $30 in 2005. Similarly, in 2002, he invested in a Scandinavian shipping firm, Frontline Limited, after the price for leasing oil tankers collapsed. The stock had plunged to $5.90, but he calculated that Frontline's liquidation value was more than $11 per share. Leasing prices would eventually rebound, since supply would become constrained. In the meantime, Frontline could survive a cash crunch by selling ships one by one. As with Embraer, uncertainty scared investors away, but the upside potential easily outweighed the downside risk. Parbrai coined a motto that summed up this type of bet: "Heads I win, tails I don't lose much." In a matter of months, he made a 55% return. In 2005, he bet heavily on another no-brainer, a specialty steel producer called IPSCO Inc. Parbrai paid around $44 per share at a time when the company had about $15 per share of excess cash on its books. He expected IPSCO to generate around $13 per share of excess cash in each of the next 2 years, giving it a total of $41 per share in cash. With the stock trading at $44, he was effectively buying all of IPSCO's steel plants and other assets for only $3 per share. Parbrai couldn't predict what the company would earn beyond the next 2 years, but as he saw it, the stock was so cheap that there was scant risk of losing money. When he sold in 2007, his $24.7 million investment was worth $87.2 million, a 253% return in 26 months. In recent years, it's become almost an article of faith that it's impossible to beat the market over the long run. But Parbrai, thanks to Buffett and Munger, had found a formula for outperformance. As we've seen, the key principles were not that difficult to identify and clone. Be patient and selective, saying no to almost everything. Exploit the market's bipolar mood swings. Buy stocks at a big discount to their underlying value. Stay within your circle of competence. Avoid anything too hard. Make a small number of mispriced bets with minimal downside and significant upside. Yet Parbry was almost alone in his fanatical determination to observe these rules. "Nobody else is willing to do this," he marvels. "It might as well be the Indian guy." Parbry wanted to express his gratitude in person. So in July 2007, he teamed up with his best friend, Guy Spear, to enter a charity auction for a power lunch with Buffett. In the interests of disclosure, I should mention that Spear is one of my closest friends. I've been an investor in his hedge fund, Aquamarine, for 20 years. I've edited his fund's annual report on several occasions. I'm an advisor to the board of his investment firm. I also helped him to write his memoir, The Education of a Value Investor. In other words, I'm an unusually close observer of Spear's, but not an impartial one. Parbry and Spear, a Zurich-based hedge fund manager who is similarly obsessed with Buffett, won the auction with a bid of $650,100. The money would go to the Glide Foundation, a charity that helps the homeless. But Parbry saw the donation as his version of a guru dakshana, a Hindu term for a gift presented to your spiritual teacher when your education is complete. On June 25, 2008, Parbry finally met his guru. They spent 3 hours together at a Manhattan steakhouse, Smith and Walensky, ensconced in a wood-paneled alcove at the back of the restaurant. Parbry brought his wife Harina and their 2 daughters, Monsoon and Momachi, who sat on either side of Buffett. Since then, Parbry has divorced. Spear brought his wife, Laurie. Buffett, who was jovial and grandfatherly, brought bags of gifts for the kids, including M&Ms with his picture on them. The conversation ranged from his favorite company, Geico, to the person he had most liked to meet, either Sir Isaac Newton, who was probably the smartest human in history, or Sophia Loren, for less cerebral reasons. For Parbry, the lunch yielded 2 unforgettable lessons, one about how to invest, one about how to live. The first came when he asked Buffett, "Whatever happened to Rick Guerin?" Buffett had mentioned Guerin's superb investment record in The Super Investors of Graham and Doddsville. But Buffett told Parbry and Spear that Guerin used margin loans to leverage his investments because he was in a hurry to get rich. According to Buffett, Guerin was hit with margin calls after suffering disastrous losses in the crash of 1973 to 74. As a result, he was forced to sell shares to Buffett that were later worth an immense fortune. Guerin gave his shareholders quite a ride, losing 42% in 1973 and 34.4% in 1974. Even so, his compounded rate of return over 19 years was 23.6% after fees. By contrast, Buffett said that he and Munger were never in a hurry because they always knew they'd become enormously rich if they kept compounding over decades without too many catastrophic mistakes. Over his meal of steak, hash browns, and a cherry Coke, Buffett said, "If you're even a slightly above average investor who spends less than you earn, over a lifetime, you cannot help but get very wealthy." Parbry says this morality tale about the perils of leverage and impatience has been seared into his brain. Right there, the Buffett lunch was worth it. But what resonated most profoundly for Parbry was the sense that Buffett was true to himself, that he lived in extraordinary alignment with his own personality, principles, and preferences. Over lunch, Buffett explained that he and Munger always measure themselves by an inner scorecard. Instead of worrying how others judged them, they focus on living up to their own exacting standards. One way to tell whether you live by an inner or an outer scorecard, said Buffett, is to ask yourself, would I rather be the worst lover in the world and be known publicly as the best, or the best lover in the world and be known publicly as the worst? Buffett manages every aspect of his life in ways that mesh with his own nature, from his childish diet, which consists largely of burgers, candy, and Coca-Cola, to how he runs his business. For example, he made it clear that Berkshire's decentralized structure was never designed to maximize profits. It simply suited his character to oversee Berkshire's many businesses in a hands-off manner, trusting his CEOs to use their freedom wisely. Likewise, he pointed out that he handles his own daily schedule and keeps it blissfully uncluttered by rebuffing almost any request that might distract him from reading and contemplation. Similarly, he insists on working solely with people he likes and admires. As a stock picker too, he has always gone his own way, avoiding whatever overvalued asset class is currently in vogue. This discussion had an enduring impact on Pabrai and Speer. In May 2014, I joined them at Berkshire's annual meeting. The next day, we flew from Omaha to New York on a private plane that Speer had chartered from NetJets, a Berkshire subsidiary. He and Pabrai had just come from a breakfast with Buffett and Munger and were giddily happy. During the flight, our main topic of conversation was this notion of living by an inner scorecard. As Pabrai saw it, probably 99% of people on this planet wonder what the world thinks of them. A tiny minority take the opposite view, which he poetically expressed as follows: "Fuck what the world thinks." Pabrai and Speer reeled off a random list of inner scorecard exemplars: Jesus, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Margaret Thatcher, Steve Jobs, and leading investors such as Buffett, Munger, Ted Weschler, Li Lu, Bill Miller, and Nick Sleep, whom we'll study in depth in Chapter 6. Pabrai observed, "All the guys who reached the pinnacle, that's the only way they got there." Nobody I've ever met lives more determinedly by his own rules than Pabrai. Buffett's example strengthened his commitment to construct a life congruent with his personality. On a typical day, Pabrai sleeps late and arrives at his office at around 10 a.m. with no agenda. An assistant brings him printouts of his emails around 11 a.m., and Pabrai scrawls the briefest of replies directly on the paper, a practice cloned from Munger. Like Buffett and Munger, Pabrai spends most of the day reading. He takes a guiltless nap most afternoons, then resumes reading until late in the evening. As much as possible, Pabrai remains inside this cocoon. He avoids meeting the CEOs of companies that he's analyzing because he thinks their talent for selling makes them an unreliable source of information, a policy he cloned from Ben Graham. Pabrai makes an exception to this policy when investing in a less developed market, such as India, where he tries to judge in person whether he can trust the management. He avoids speaking with his own shareholders, except at his annual meeting, and he refuses to meet with potential investors. I genuinely don't enjoy that whole interaction, the mumbo-jumbo of all that. It doesn't bother him if this attitude irritates people or costs him millions of dollars a year in foregone fees. Munger says he doesn't care about being rich. What he really cares about is having independence. I fully endorse that. What the money gives you is the ability to do what you want to do in the way you want to do it. And that's a tremendous benefit. Pabrai approaches relationships with the same ruthless clarity about his own priorities. During their lunch, Buffett said, "Hang out with people who are better than you, and you cannot help but improve." Pabrai acts on this advice to a degree that would horrify many people. When I meet someone for the first time, I evaluate them afterwards and say, will it make me better or worse to have a relationship with this person? If the answer is worse, he says, I'll cut him out. Likewise, after a lunch meeting, he asks, how did I enjoy that? If he didn't, there will never be another lunch with the person again. He adds, most people don't pass the smell test. Diplomacy is not his strong point, but Pabrai regards truthfulness as a higher concern. In the late 90s, he read a book titled Power versus Force, The Hidden Determinants of Human Behavior by David Hawkins, which Pabrai describes as a huge part of what I believe in. Hawkins argues that true power stems from traits such as honesty, compassion, and a dedication to enhancing other people's lives. These powerful attractors have an unconscious effect on people, making them go strong, whereas traits such as dishonesty, fear, and shame make them go weak. Pabrai took one specific lesson from Hawkins and determined to live by it. You can't get away with lying to other humans, says Pabrai, and that's a very profound idea. During the financial crisis of 2008-9, Pabrai's highly concentrated funds fell about 67% before staging a rapid recovery. At his 2009 annual meeting, he told his shareholders, "Most of the mistakes in the funds occurred because I was stupid. They didn't happen because of market issues." He highlighted several dumbass errors he had made in analyzing stocks such as Delta Financial and Sears Holdings, which were crushed. Almost none of his investors abandoned him. The lesson: you go as far out as you can on the truth variable and the payback is huge. Indeed, one of the pleasures of interviewing Pabrai is that he answers every question candidly, with no concern for how he might be judged. As an experiment, I once emailed him some impertinently personal questions, including one about his net worth. He wrote back, "Net worth as of 11/30/17 is $154 million. He then shared additional financial details to clarify what this figure excluded. It was a marvelous display of trust in the power of truthfulness. To my mind, what's most remarkable is Pabrai's unshakable consistency in sticking to such principles. When you encounter these truths that other people don't understand, you just have to latch onto them big time. He says, anytime you get a truth that humanity doesn't understand, that's a huge competitive advantage. Humanity doesn't understand power versus force. Intelligent people are easily seduced by complexity while underestimating the importance of simple ideas that carry tremendous weight. Pabrai, the ultimate pragmatist, doesn't fall into this trap. Compounding is a very simple idea. Cloning is a very simple idea. Telling the truth is a very simple idea, he says. But when you apply a handful of powerful ideas with obsessive fervor, the cumulative effect becomes unbeatable. The trouble is, most people dabble half-heartedly when they find an idea that works. Pabrai cannot conceal his contempt. These fucking humans listen and say, "Oh yeah, that makes sense, whatever, so what, I'll try to incorporate it." And you know, that fucking doesn't work. You've got to go 10,000% or not at all. As he sees it, the attitude we should clone is that of the 19th century Hindu sage Swami Vivekananda, who told his followers, take up one idea, make that one idea your life. Think of it, dream of it, live on that idea. Let the brain, muscles, nerves, every part of your body be full of that idea and just leave every other idea alone. This is the way to success. As you may have guessed, Swami Vivekananda wasn't discussing the path to investment glory. Rather, he was teaching would-be yogis how to become spiritual giants. His advice was to renounce once and for all the habit of nibbling at things and focus instead on a single objective. To succeed, you must have tremendous perseverance, tremendous will. I will drink the ocean, says the persevering soul. At my will, mountains will crumble up. Have that sort of energy, that sort of will. Work hard, and you will reach the goal. Welcome to the kidnapping capital of India. As Pabrai's fortune grew, he faced a pleasurable problem: what to do with all the money. Once again, he turned to Buffett for inspiration. Over the years, Buffett has repeatedly spoken about how little his wealth contributes to his contentment. I remember sitting with Pabrai and Spear at one of Berkshire's annual meetings when Buffett told the audience, "My life would be worse if I had 6 or 8 houses. It just doesn't correlate." Pabrai is not exactly ascetic. He once spent thousands of dollars on a pair of bespoke shoes, and he drives a blue convertible Ferrari, a fitting reward for a huge home run on Ferrari stock. But he knows that hedonism is an unreliable route to happiness. He's also wary of bequeathing hundreds of millions to his daughters, having internalized Buffett's advice that the ideal amount to give your kids is enough so they can do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. Buffett had pledged to give the bulk of his billions back to society, so Pabrai decided to clone the giving. He began by asking, if I were to die today, what cause or organization would I want most of my assets to go to? He wanted a charity managed like a cost-efficient business, with precise metrics tracking how much good it did for every dollar spent. Nothing excited him until, in 2006, he stumbled on an article about a program in rural India run by Anand Kumar, a math teacher who gave free coaching and accommodation to 30 poor high school graduates each year. The Super 30 program had an incredible success rate in preparing them for the IIT entrance exam. Pabrai grasped at once the strength of this model. It was low cost, offered talented teenagers a life-changing chance to escape from poverty, and provided measurable results. He emailed Kumar, offering him money to enlarge the program. But Kumar didn't want to expand. Undeterred, Pabrai made a fateful decision. You gotta take a trip and just show up. Bihar, which was often described as the kidnapping capital of India, wasn't an alluring destination for a high-flying hedge fund manager. So Pabrai hired 2 bodyguards from a New Delhi security firm to accompany him on his mission. One was a former Black Cat commando, an Indian counterterrorism specialist, trained to storm hijacked aircraft and take the kidnapper out. From being asleep to killing the guy was less than 3 seconds. The commando had to travel separately by train to Bihar because he couldn't carry his gun on the plane. It later turned out that Kumar had also hired 4 bodyguards to ensure Pabrai's safety. Pabrai found Bihar a desolate and desperate place where thieves would sometimes steal railway tracks and sell them for scrap. His grumpy verdict: the weather sucks, the infrastructure sucks, the hotel sucks. Pabrai harbors fantasies of becoming so enlightened that he could happily stay in 1-star hotels. Alas, he's not there yet. Still, despite the discomfort, he would never forget the day he spent with Kumar, who taught his students in a rented shed without walls. Pabrai was blown away by his intellect, passion, and gift for teaching. He's one in hundreds of millions. Unable to convince Kumar to take his money, Pabrai requested permission to replicate and scale up the Super 30 program. His appropriation of Buffett's investment strategy had proven to him the power of cloning. So why not apply the same approach to philanthropy? Kumar gave him his blessing, and Pabrai set to work. Kumar's renown meant that thousands of students applied to his program. He then handpicked the most brilliant. Pabrai solved the problem of sourcing brainiacs by partnering with a government-run network of almost 600 selective boarding schools, which educate tens of thousands of poor rural children each year. Pabrai's Dakshana Foundation offered scholarships to hundreds of the most promising brains from this pool and gave them 2 years of coaching in math, physics, and chemistry to prepare for the IIT exam. If they don't bust their asses, they're going back to the villages with nothing. Says Pabrai, this is their one shot. The strength of this philanthropic model is that it costs so little to change so many lives. In 2008, Dakshana's total cost per scholar was $3,913, and 34% of its students won places at IIT. By 2016, Dakshana had become so efficient that its cost per student had dropped to $2,649, and its success rate hit an astonishing 85%. Even better, the government heavily subsidizes both the boarding schools and IIT. Pabrai figures that for every dollar Dakshana spends on a student, the government spends more than $1,000. So he's effectively making a leveraged bet with an enormous social return on his invested capital. By the end of 2018, Pabrai's family had given more than $27 million to Dakshana. The biggest outside donors are Prem Watsa, the CEO of Fairfax Financial Holdings and a graduate of IIT, and Radhakishan Damani, who is said to be India's second richest person. Disclosure, I've given a few $1,000s to Dakshina. Before meeting Buffett for lunch in 2008, Pabrai sent him Dakshina's first annual report. Buffett was so impressed that he shared it with Munger and Bill Gates. Then, in an interview with Fox TV, Buffett declared that Pabrai thinks as well about philanthropy as he does about investments. I admire him enormously. The disciple, the shameless copycat, had been blessed by the master. After that, says Pabrai, I felt that I could die and go to heaven. Since then, Dakshina has grown exponentially. By 2018, it was coaching more than 1,000 students simultaneously at 8 sites across India, including a 109-acre campus called Dakshina Valley, which Pabrai bought at a discount from a distressed seller. Eventually, this site alone could accommodate 2,600 students. Meanwhile, Dakshina has broadened its focus beyond IIT. It now also prepares hundreds of poverty-stricken students for the entrance exam to medical schools. In 2019 alone, 164 Dakshina scholars won places to study medicine, a 64% success rate. All of these initiatives are managed by Dakshina's CEO, a retired artillery officer named Colonel Ram Sharma, who charges 1 rupee per year for his services. The Colonel, who is one of the most admirable people I've ever encountered, has a deep sense of mission that's connected to the loss of his daughter. He once told me that God had taken 1 child from him and given him 1,000. In other words, what began as a humble replica of Kumar's program has become a behemoth, a testament to the fact that intelligent cloning involves more than just crude imitation. In Dakshina's case, Pabrai borrowed a model that worked in miniature and rebuilt it on an industrial scale. His success is because of his attention to detail, says Colonel Sharma. I can definitely say that. After reading a draft of this book, Guy Spear wrote me an email to emphasize that there's nothing nonchalant about Pabrai's approach to cloning. I worry that Shameless Cloner does not quite capture the remarkable intensity and ferocity with which Monish has cloned the right things. Indeed, it seems to me that underlying all of the personalities in your book, there is a deep intensity and ferocity of purpose that is obscured by their calm exteriors. When Pabrai and I traveled to Dakshina Valley, we met with Ashok Talapatra, one of the Foundation's star alumni. Talapatra told me that he grew up in a $6 per month shack in a slum in Hyderabad as the son of a tailor who earned $100 a month. Their home was so basic that it had a pink shower curtain instead of a front door and an asbestos roof that failed to keep out the rain. When Pabrai and his daughter, Monsoon, visited Talapatra there, his mother served them chai and snacks on top of a stool because the family didn't own a table. But Talapatra was a brilliant student. He aced the IIT entrance exam, ranking 63rd out of 471,000 applicants, the highest position that any Dakshina scholar had ever achieved. He went on to study computer science and engineering at IIT Bombay, then landed a 6-figure job at Google. After a stint in London, he moved to the company's headquarters in California, where he now works as a software engineer. He's moving up the ranks, says Pabrai. He's on a very rapid trajectory. Within a year of joining Google, Talapatra bought his parents a new apartment with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, air conditioning, and an impermeable roof. Talapatra's remarkable journey hasn't stopped there. Inspired by Pabrai, who has become a friend and a mentor, he's increasingly fascinated by investing. Pabrai recommends investment books to him, and Talapatra regularly joins him at Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting. When I see them together in Omaha and consider the impact that Pabrai has had on Talapatra's life, I'm amazed that one man's knack for betting on mispriced stocks has produced so much good. In sentimental moments, I find myself thinking of the Talmudic saying, Whoever saves one life, it is considered as if he saved the whole world. But Pabrai, in his brutally honest way, ridicules any notion that he's some sort of righteous savior. While sitting in a taxi in Mumbai, he tells me, "Once you have a sense that life is meaningless, what should you do? Not fuck it up for other people. Leave the planet a better place than you found it. Do a good job with your kids. The rest of it is a game. It doesn't matter." Lessons from Monish. After many conversations with Pabrai, I found myself thinking more and more about the power of cloning and how to use it in my own life. On a plane ride home from Irvine, I even wrote a memo to myself entitled Lessons from Monish. It began with two fundamental questions. What winning habits are out in the open that I should clone? And who should I clone? For example, it makes sense for me, as a non-fiction writer, to reverse engineer books by authors I admire, such as Michael Lewis, Malcolm Gladwell, and Oliver Sacks. While reading Sacks' autobiography On the Move, I discovered that his writing was also the product of cloning. Sacks, a neurologist who wrote spellbinding case histories about his patients' disorders, recalled reading The Mind of a Mnemonist, a 1968 book by a Soviet neuropsychologist named A.R. Luria. That book, which recounts the history of a patient of Luria's who had a limitless memory, altered the focus and direction of my life, wrote Sacks, by serving as an exemplar not only for awakenings but for everything else I was to write. When I read Luria's book, I was thrilled to discover that he too was a cloner. In writing his medical case histories, Luria said, "I tried to follow in the steps of Walter Pater in Imaginary Portraits, written in 1887. Once I started searching, I found a whole host of cloners in various fields, including business. For example, in explaining Walmart's success, Munger observed, Sam Walton invented practically nothing, but he copied everything anybody else ever did that was smart, and he did it with more fanaticism. So he just blew right by them all." As I considered Pabrai's life and what I should learn from him, several principles particularly resonated with me. In my memo, I wrote, Rule 1, clone like crazy. Rule 2, hang out with people who are better than you. Rule 3, treat life as a game, not as a survival contest or a battle to the death. Rule 4, be in alignment with who you are. Don't do what you don't want to do or what's not right for you. Rule 5, live by an inner scorecard. Don't worry about what others think of you. Don't be defined by external validation. Finally, quoting a line of Munger's that Pabrai often cites, I wrote, take a simple idea and take it seriously. Of all these lessons, that last one might just be the most important. Too often, we encounter a powerful principle or habit and we contemplate it, take it for a quick spin, and then forget about it. Pabrai becomes consumed by it. He lives by it. That's a habit I have to clone. But the goal here isn't to become a slavish follower of someone else's ideas. It's often smarter to take the spirit of a principle and adapt it to suit our own priorities. For example, I kept thinking about Pabrai's fixation on going as far out as you can on the truth variable. That led me to wonder, what if you were to focus instead on going as far out as you can on the kindness variable or the compassion variable? Pabrai's habit of focusing single-mindedly and without compromise on a specific virtue has real power, but we don't have to choose the same virtue. I think it also works best when we clone in ways that match our own talents and temperament. Pabrai and Spear often discuss companies before deciding whether to invest in them, a practice they cloned from Buffett and Munger. As a result, they tend to own many of the same stocks. But Spear's position sizes are significantly smaller because he's more cautious and less self-confident than Pabrai. As he puts it, I don't have balls of steel like Monish. In 2015, Parbray had half of his fund's assets in just 2 investments, Fiat Chrysler and General Motors warrants. Speer, who had about a quarter of his assets in them, found Parbray's level of concentration breathtakingly scary and worried that he had failed to protect his friend from hubris and overconfidence. Another hedge fund manager warned that Parbray's overweighting of the auto sector was batshit crazy. But Parbray made 7 times his money in 6 years as Fiat's stock surged. Unrepentant, he had 70% of his offshore fund's assets in 2 stocks in 2018, a fearlessly aggressive stance that led to a 42% loss that year. As Speer once told me, the border between brilliance and stupidity is hard to discern. Parbray's strategy of extreme concentration is influenced by Munger, who has said that a well-diversified portfolio needs just 4 stocks. But it would be suicidal for you or me to clone that approach unless we share Parbray's extreme intestinal fortitude and analytical gifts. When I asked him how he coped with the stress of a 67% drawdown during the financial crisis of 2008-9, he said, "I don't have stress. My wife couldn't even detect that there was an issue." On the contrary, the stocks he bought amid the crash were so cheap that he found the experience orgasmic. Psychologically, it also helps that Parbray doesn't take anything too seriously. He once told me, "On my gravestone, I want them to write, he loved to play games, especially games he knew he could win. Cloning is a game, blackjack is a game, bridge is a game, Darkshire is a game. And, of course, the stock market is a game. It's just a bunch of games. It's all about the odds." What's amazing to Parbray is how easy it's been to stack those odds in his favor by studying other people's playbooks and consistently borrowing their best moves. "The thing is, none of this stuff is hard," he says with an exuberant laugh. "Don't spill the beans, man. Don't tell the world." Chapter 2. The Willingness to be Lonely. To beat the market, you must be brave enough, independent enough, and strange enough to stray from the crowd. It is impossible to produce superior performance unless you do something different from the majority. Sir John Templeton. Walking along a beach in the Bahamas more than 20 years ago, I stumbled upon a peculiar sight. An old man was immersed up to his neck in the ocean, dressed in a long-sleeved shirt and a ridiculous-looking hat with a visor and ear flaps. His face was smothered with thick dollops of sun cream. I ducked behind a palm tree so that he wouldn't catch me spying on him. Then I watched for several minutes while he pumped his arms and legs back and forth, power walking against the resistance of the water. I later discovered that he did this for 45 minutes each day. The old man was Sir John Templeton, probably the greatest international investor of the 20th century. Art traveled from New York to the Bahamas to interview him in his home at the Lyford Key Club, a gated idyll whose residents have included Prince Rainier III of Monaco, the Aga Khan, and Sean Connery. But if my memory serves me, we weren't scheduled to meet until the following day. This was the kind of reporting trip that makes a journalist's heart sing. An interview with a fabled icon in an exotic location with all expenses paid by a rich magazine that hadn't yet been clobbered by the advent of the internet. Templeton had a spectacular investment record. The Templeton Growth Fund, which he'd founded in 1954, racked up an average annual return of 14.5% over 38 years. A $100,000 stake would have grown to more than $17 million in that time. Templeton, who was born in 1912 in a small town in rural Tennessee, had started out with nothing and ended up a billionaire. I wanted to know how he had done it and what the rest of us could learn from this act of alchemy. He was 85 at the time, the grand old man of the investment world, and I'd half expected him to look like a sage. Instead, I found myself spellbound by this unlikely image of him marching through the surf in his comical hat. But as I would eventually realize, My glimpse of his fitness regimen provided an important insight into his greatness. Templeton had figured out an efficient way to exercise for free in a gorgeous setting. It was utterly irrelevant to him that anyone might think he looked strange, and this indifference was essential to his success. Michael Lipper, the president of an investment firm called Lipper Advisory Services, once remarked to me that Templeton, George Soros, and Warren Buffett shared one invaluable characteristic: the willingness to be lonely, the willingness to take a position that others don't think is too bright. They have an inner conviction that a lot of people do not have. That phrase, the willingness to be lonely, has stuck in my mind for many years. It eloquently conveys the critical idea that the best investors are not like other people. They are iconoclasts, mavericks, and misfits who see the world differently from the crowd and follow their own peculiar path, not just in the way they invest, but in the way they think and live. François Rochon, a Canadian money manager who has beaten the market by a mile over the last quarter of a century, has an intriguing theory. As we all know, the human genetic code developed over hundreds of thousands of years to support the primary objective of survival. One lesson we learned at least 200,000 years ago is that it's safer to belong to a tribe. That unconscious instinct tends to kick in almost irresistibly when we feel under threat, says Rochon. For example, when stocks plummet, the average investor sees others panicking and instinctively follows the tribe by selling stocks and fleeing to the safe haven of cash. What the tribe followers fail to recognize is the counterintuitive truth that this might be the perfect time to buy stocks since they're now on sale. But I think some people in the race don't have that tribal gene, says Rochon, so they don't feel the urge to follow a tribe. And those people can become good investors because they can think for themselves. Rochon, who uses his talent for stock picking to bankroll his passion for collecting art, suspects that many artists, writers, and entrepreneurs also lack the tribal gene. Rochon's theory is entirely unprovable, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that the best investors are wired in unusual ways that may be financially advantageous. One famed investor, who asked not to be quoted by name on this subject, told me that many of his most successful peers are kind of Aspergerish, and that almost all are unemotional. He points out that it's a help to be unemotional when making unconventional bets that the crowd would consider foolish. He adds that people with developmental conditions such as Asperger's syndrome often have something else in compensation, and very often it's numeracy. Being unemotional and numerate is a great combination for investing. I mentioned this idea to another hugely successful fund manager who is mathematically gifted and extremely uncomfortable in social situations. He confided, "When I was a child, my parents were concerned that I was autistic or might have a touch of Asperger's. I think they concluded no, or at least it wasn't damaging enough. So yeah, it might be that I'm slightly on the spectrum, or not." He then recalled a devastating childhood trauma that also led him to distance himself from his emotions. So, if you're thinking I'm a psycho chicken, you may be right. It's worth acknowledging that there are intense controversies over diagnostic labels such as Asperger's syndrome, a form of high-functioning autism named for a Nazi pediatrician who advocated child euthanasia. My goal here isn't to make amateur diagnoses of great investors, but to suggest that many seem to be wired in ways that give them a temperamental edge. One of the most insightful perspectives on this subject comes from Christopher Davis, who oversees about $25 billion in assets at Davis Advisors, an investment firm founded by his father in 1969. He's unusually well-positioned to observe the idiosyncratic personalities of the most successful investors. He's friends with high-profile practitioners such as Buffett, Munger, Mason Hawkins, and Bill Miller. Moreover, his grandfather, Shelby Cullum Davis, and father, Shelby M.C. Davis, were both investment legends who amassed colossal fortunes in the stock market. A necessary characteristic of great investors is that they can't be overly influenced by what other people think, says Davis. The easiest way not to be overly influenced by what other people think is not to be that aware of what they think. If you don't really notice that and don't really care about what other people think, that will make it easier to be a great investor. It follows, says Davis, that a prevalent characteristic in great investors would be low emotional intelligence. He observes that many of the best investors struggle when it comes to bonding with others and nurturing warm attachments in their family life. By contrast, says Davis, you tend to encounter an entirely different psychological profile among CEOs. They require the emotional intelligence to empathize with others, understand their thoughts, and influence them. But for a contrarian investor, it would be catastrophic if you were constantly burdened by an awareness of what everybody else was thinking about your decision. In their youth, he adds, many CEOs played team sports, captained a team, or led a fraternity. What about the best investors? By and large, says Davis, they favored individual sports such as running, tennis, golf, or swimming. You won't get a lot of football, lacrosse, that sort of thing. His father, now in his 80s, was one of the investment titans of his generation. During Shelby Davis's 28 years as manager of the New York Venture Fund, a $100,000 investment would have grown to about $3.8 million. So how did he fit the psychological profile painted by his son? My father was very deeply a loner, says Davis. I can't imagine him playing team sports, being president of a fraternity, or leading a nonprofit. He just was constantly looking for information, grilling people, and reading annual reports. It was a lonely sort of work. I mean, it was him and a telephone, or him and a stack of annual reports and quarterly reports. His description reminds me of Buffett's politely dismissive response to Monish Pabrai after the latter offered to work for him for free. I simply do best operating by myself. Indeed, Buffett famously spends much of his time sitting alone in his office in Omaha with the blinds drawn, enraptured by the solitary joy of reading annual reports. Beyond these broad patterns, there are plenty of exceptions and nuances. I'm not suggesting that all of the best investors have developmental disorders, or lead lonely lives, or are destined to divorce. Though the list of divorced investment giants is certainly long, including Munger, Miller, Pabrai, Bill Ackman, Carl Icahn, David Einhorn, and countless others. That would be a gross exaggeration. Plus, it's inane to pathologize every quirk or eccentricity. Still, despite these caveats and disclaimers, I think it's true that all of the investors you'll meet in this book are non-tribal free thinkers. They have a rare capacity to defy conventional opinion. They care much more about being right and winning than gaining social acceptance or approval. Matthew McLennan, who oversees more than $100 billion at First Eagle Investment Management, describes his job this way. Every day, you're trying to understand how the world works, bottom up, top down, and you're trying to synthesize it in a way that's different from the consensus. At the end of the day, we're paid to see the world through a different prism. The only way to beat the market is to diverge from the market. That's a task best suited to people who are quite literally extraordinary, both intellectually and temperamentally. So perhaps it's no surprise that this is a game that favors brilliant oddballs. And in my experience, nobody was more brilliant or odd than Sir John Templeton. A pioneer of global value investing, he figured out entirely for himself a set of principles and practices that can benefit any investor to this day. But looking back now, long after his death in 2008 at the age of 95, I realized that I failed to grasp the most valuable lessons of his life. The making of a maverick. It was the fall of 1998 when I met Templeton. Even then, a couple of weeks before his 86th birthday, He still showed up for work each day at his office in the city of Nassau, a short drive from his home. Our day together began in that office, where he greeted me in a genteel manner from a bygone era. "My time is at your discretion," he said, with a soft southern twang. "I'll stay as long as you need me." He was dressed in a pale